Hello and welcome to the latest of our Broadcast Revolution events, which on this occasion comes from our headquarters here at Portland Place in London, just a few doors down from the BBC's iconic broadcasting house. Joining me as our guest today is, if I can say, another BBC icon, Eleanor Oldroyd, who has been one of the corporation's leading radio, news and sports broadcasters for quite a long time now. We'll say that, no more. I worked alongside Ellie, both on air and as a producer, for many years at BBC Radio 5 Live. She presents numerous sports programmes for that network, cricket coverage in particular, and the network's weekend breakfast programme on Saturdays and Sundays as well. She's anchored radio coverage of every Summer Olympics going back to Barcelona 92.
Correct.
Absolutely. It's not just the biggest of the sports events, though, that we're going to be talking about today. Ellie has become rather the go-to woman for the BBC, leading radio commentator for the corporation's coverage of the coronation, the funerals of the Queen and Prince Philip, and also the wedding of Harry and Meghan some 5 years ago now. Just before we get underway, a couple of points of order for you if you are watching this live stream of our chat today. If you'd like to ask a question of Ellie at any point, do so via our Twitter account. @BroadcastRevo is the place to go, or you can ask a question or join the chat using the hashtag #JoinTheBroadcastRevolution. Our Twitter account @BroadcastRevo, and I'll do my best to keep up with any questions that come through. There's also going to be a short poll that will pop up on your screen as we wrap up things today. So do please answer the questions there. It does help us shape the events we do for you in future. First of all, Ellie, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And in Ashes Week as well. So you're busy enough as it is.
That's true. Actually, while you were talking, I was just doing the maths, and I think it's 35 years since I started my London broadcasting career in Broadcasting House, as you say, just a couple of blocks away from where we are. So that I'm not quite as old as the building.
Well,
but it has an important part of
an
old broadcasting house. Yes, in the old broadcasting house. So yes, Ashes Week, absolutely, it starts on Friday. And the lovely thing about this Ashes summer actually is that it's the men's Ashes and the women's Ashes are going to be, hand in hand pretty much throughout the whole summer. So I start at Edgbaston on Friday with the first men's test match, and then when that wraps up, I am almost immediately going to Nottingham for the women's test match at Trent Bridge. So that's great to see men's and women's sport, operating in tandem, because it has not always been the case in my career. So
how long has actually the women's Ashes been covered in this sort of way?
Well, this is the first time I can remember it being covered in quite such a very much being promoted side by side with the men's. So this is down to the ECB, the BBC are doing it as well. If you have seen any of the BBC trails that they're putting out at the moment, then you have images of Heather Knight and Ben Stokes and Izzy Wong and James Anderson, and they're all knitted together. And it feels like there is just a recognition factor with women's sport that is a very, very recent thing, I would say, in the last 5 years.
Glass ceilings are being shattered here. They're being shattered by people like you as well. We'll talk a bit about that shortly. If I may, I'll ask you really about a momentous 12 months, really, in your career. I mean, you've been in that privileged position, but that high pressure position of covering a coronation and a funeral of Her Majesty the Queen. Human question first, how nervous were you before that?
Well, it's interesting we start talking about the cricket, because I got my notepad out for last summer's cricket coverage, and I opened it up, and on the first day of what would have been the final test match between England and South Africa at the Oval, I'd written down the notes at the top. I'd said England against South Africa at the Oval, final test, and then there was a blank page because we got the news that the Queen had died during that day, and they didn't actually play any cricket on that first day, and in fact not till what would have been day 3. So I didn't do any of that test match in the end. But the day that the news came through that the Queen had died, it was one of those moments where you thought, right, okay, this is something that we've all been expecting for a long time. I mean, let's be honest.
We practiced.
We practiced. When you were working, when we were working together at the BBC, we practiced rehearsals of the obituary. And that moment that she died, we knew was going to be one of those heart-stopping moments for the whole nation, really. And the broadcaster who was on air at that point was going to have that responsibility of actually, either breaking the news themselves or handing to Radio 4 to break the news, or to a pooled programme. But on that day, so I thought, right, okay, it starts now. At least the countdown has begun, and it will be it was 11 days after that first day.
Long period.
A long period. The day after she died, I was in St Paul's Cathedral presenting a service.
You were at the Oval, and then
Yeah.
the next day you were at St Paul's.
Yes.
For a service.
For a service. So I came actually up to Broadcasting House the next morning, and met my producer, and we sat down with the order of service for that service, and then went to St Paul's, and just there was a bit of a rehearsal, and then the service happened that day, and we just we were in that zone at that point, and then during the week I was part of the commentary team for the whole of BBC Radio, so everything comes together. It's not Radio 4, 5 Live.
News.
BBC Radio News, BBC Events, so it's across Radio 4, Radio 5, World Service, nations and regions, and so on. So I was part of that commentary on the procession to the lying in state in Westminster Hall. So I was on top of Westminster Hall, and then on the day of the funeral itself, I was at St George's Chapel for the committal service. So the final part of that great day of ceremonial, of solemnity as well. So you had the state funeral in Westminster Abbey, and then the committal service at St George's, which was, I think, more of a personal family thing in a way. That's the way we felt that it was going to be, because this was, as we all do at times in our lives, a family saying goodbye to a loved one. So, and I think when I thought about what I was going to say at the end of that service, because you do think a lot, and actually I woke up in the early hours of the morning, I think one morning during that week, thinking, okay, this is what I will say finally, and it was all about the fact that the crown jewels were taken off the coffin that day and put to one side on the altar. So the instruments of state, as they're known, were lifted, and then she was a grandmother. She was a grandmother, she was a mother, she was a great grandmother, and this was the point when she was going to join the rest of her family in the vault underneath St George's Chapel, and then later to be interred in the chapel with her father and mother.
Does the emotion ever catch up with you? Because it's a long period to be on the air, and you're very much part of the occasion, and reflecting it, I can imagine you could almost feel a catch at the back of your throat almost.
You feel it more afterwards, actually, and maybe it's slightly in anticipation. I mean, when on the day, I think the adrenaline does kick in for all of these things. I mean, you've covered big news stories as well. If it's a major breaking tragic story. So I was on air on the day of the Hillsborough disaster in 1989, working for Radio 1 in those days. And we were doing updates all the way through the afternoon. We were doing news bulletins into Radio 1. And you just do it. You say, right, okay, what's the latest news? What are the latest figures? What do we know? What can we report? Look, we need to get the information out there as dispassionately as we can. And I remember coming out of Broadcasting House afterwards that afternoon, because, I watched and still watch a lot of sport and a lot of football. My brothers were probably at football that day. My then boyfriend was at football that day. And I just remember standing outside Broadcasting House in Portland Place in tears, just at the thought of the impact that it was having on everyone else. But actually, when you're in that moment, something about your professional instinct kicks in. And so it didn't feel emotional at that time.
I was going to ask you about, there might be some people going, almost surprised that people from live sports broadcasting are then linked to such momentous, very solemn news occasions. But of course, in essence, you've just answered that, in that actually live sports broadcasting is, I think, radio, television, at its absolutely most stressful, at its most demanding. You have to capture the moment, you have to describe. I don't think there's many people better qualified than somebody who does live broadcast sport to actually cover these momentous events. And a lot of the BBC Sports team have been woven into coronation and funeral coverage.
Absolutely. Going back, until the start of the BBC broadcasting on live events, because back in the 1930s, it was sport and events, sport and outside broadcasts. So an outside broadcast could be a royal occasion. It could be the trooping of the colour. It could be it could be a royal funeral or a royal wedding. It could be the Derby or the Ashes or the FA Cup final. So my predecessor at the coronation in Westminster Abbey doing that commentary was John Snagg, who was famous.
Lead announcer of the BBC.
Yes, and famous for his boat race commentary and his commentary on sporting events. John Arlott, who some people will remember as being one of the great cricket commentators, was on the processional route for the coronation in 1953. And this has always been the case, that there have been a significant number of sports names that are brought in to do commentary because, we can look around. If something's not happening in the order that it's supposed to be happening, you might think when everything's going to happen, but it's never going to happen precisely to time. So you need to be able to look around and say, the trees in full bloom at this time of year and the blue skies and the colours of the buildings and the people watching, because it's what we do all the time in sport. Yes. And also things that are unexpected. That's what sport is about.
There is a marriage of skills in that there are you, a sports broadcaster, largely, and you're working actually with your producer on these occasions. It often comes from the BBC religion team, for example. It is actually all hands to the pumps, the best of the best, frankly.
It is, absolutely. Well, the producer in the studio, actually, for the coronation, is one of our best and most experienced sports producers, a chap called Graham Macmillan, who has produced Ryder Cup for the BBC, so he's used to handling a large outside broadcast event. But specifically with the things that I've done in the chapel or in the Abbey, so you say the wedding of Harry and Meghan, and then the funerals of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh and the coronation, are produced by religion, as you say, the religion department, who are based in Salford. And so the producer that I worked with on the Queen's funeral and then the coronation, Ben Collingwood, is somebody who is a producer in religion. So he works with music the whole time. He works with services. He does live programs every week. But I'm a vicar's daughter, so I know what a church service is like. I sing in a choir, so I know how many bars you're going to have to talk over up to a certain point. As well as the sports experience as well. So it's quite a bringing together of those different skills.
A glut of questions already reaching us via our Twitter account, @BroadcastRevo. Do, if you can, add your name or the organisation you work with or for, just so I can shout that out as well. But this one, what is harder, asks an unnamed individual, reporting on a momentous breaking news moment, a significant news moment, or a sporting event? I imagine there are similar skill sets. I don't know which is harder though.
There are. I mean, you are. I mean, a big breaking news story, you can't really be prepared for in a factual sense. So the last time I did that, I think, was the first morning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So when it was March last year, and but at that point you are drawing together the bit of knowledge that you have. So hopefully you know a little bit about the history of Russian ambitions towards that part of the world, as it were. But you are learning from scratch. So it's your broadcasting experience, it's your ability to filter out facts, to have multiple screens up at the same time to know what's going on. But you're asking the simple questions. You're asking what's happening, why is it happening, what happens next, and so on. So and a sports event, hopefully you've done some prep in advance. So you have team sheets, you have stats from previous years, but then yes, but both of them have an equal element of the unknown about them, I suppose.
I think what's fascinating, I mean, the viewing figures for these large events, I think 30 million television viewers were watching the Queen's funeral, 20 million television viewers in the UK were watching the coronation. There are millions listening in on radio as well. I'm always fascinated to see the challenges faced by a TV commentator versus a radio commentator. A TV commentator, I mean, you were working alongside one of the greats for the Queen's funeral. David Dimbleby was covering part of that for the Queen. But you, in radio, you can't hide behind the pictures. You have to keep talking and describing, pausing perhaps for music, as you say, and elements of the service. But my goodness, you talk a lot more than the TV commentator.
There's a lot of description. There is a lot of description, particularly for the coronation, because it hadn't happened obviously in 70 years. I brought in. I have a prop.
This is the script.
This is the script for the coronation, which we worked on and changed and adapted endlessly.
A lot of your words in this. It's not
pretty
just
much
handed
all my words.
to you.
No. Yeah. Absolutely. So that was the blank canvas to start with, which is the order of service.
Right.
For the coronation. That's not
That's thick.
that's thick. So because it was a long, obviously a long service. I mean,
Well, 2 hours.
2 hours pretty much. I mean, that was an hour less than for the Queen in 1953. But there are a lot of things in the service which are prayers and hymns and bits of ceremonial, which you can't, obviously, you have to describe the ceremonial bits, but you're not talking over the prayers. You know, you're being very selective about what you talk over music-wise. But you have got to paint a picture. You know, you've got to paint that picture of what the Abbey looks like. So I was down there for about 3 weeks beforehand, so before they closed the Abbey. I went down with my neighbour, actually, who lives downstairs, who's just trained to be a blue badge guide. So she knows the Abbey really well. So I went around and I thought, this is the colour of the stone and this is the height of the nave. And just to get a sense beforehand of, you know, the roof of the choir is blue with gold stars.
Yeah.
So there were things that I would have to describe, which would work into the script beforehand. But you have to have a script, really. So you have to be able to react to unexpected things, you know, to facial expressions. So at the end of the ceremony, as the king was processing out, he did smile, I think, for the first time probably that we'd seen, because he looked very solemn, I think.
During the coronation
itself. It was a moment that he'd waited his whole life for, more or less.
Yes.
So you could see the weight on his face, but you want to be able to reflect that emotion when you're there. But you've got so many things which have to be so precisely described at particular times, and you've also got to be able to let the service and the moment speak for itself as well, and to give it the silence that it needs, and to be able to hear the music and to react to the emotion of the music as well.
By nature, we knew the coronation was coming, and then you say you were actually there some weeks before. The Queen's funeral was 10 days after her death. You have far less lead-up time to that, obviously. Just how much rehearsal time do you have, first of all, for a royal funeral of that significance?
Well, I mean, there is a pattern to how you do these things now, and it has been quite an extraordinary time, actually, for me as a broadcaster, really. And there is a certain fortune in timing, in that I had the experience of the royal wedding in 2018, and then a number of other services. So all the time you're preparing, you're building up that experience of what it feels like to be part of a big service, to know how to structure a script with a producer. And so one of the things that we did for the Queen's funeral and for the coronation is that there is a full rehearsal of the service on the couple of days beforehand. So we make a recording of that, which is completely and utterly for our own use, not to be broadcast anywhere. And then we rehearse over the top of it. So we will listen to it and say, okay, right, we've got enough time to say this at this point. So you are preparing, you're reading things. So for the coronation, I read a number of books about past coronation and the significance of certain things. So, you know, you want to be able to talk about the significance of the different objects in the crown jewels, you know, so the orb, which represents the world, with the cross on the top, which represents the Christian world, you know, so Christ in majesty over the world itself, you know, the globe, whatever your beliefs are from that point of view. But these are all sort of historically and symbolically important things, which you can't just guess what they are. And you also have to know, you know, how to describe them.
Yeah.
You know, what the different jewels are in, you know, King Edward's crown, St Edward's crown, and in the imperial state crown. So to say there are 2,000 diamonds in Queen Mary's crown, which is what the Queen Camilla was crowned with. So you write down an awful lot of stuff, and I had little note cards as well. So in case my script failed, I had flash, or in case there was a long delay for some reason, I had flashcards.
Well, I can't imagine what it's like to suddenly sit there and go, okay, cue, and you are on your own. There's not what we call a presenter's friend alongside you to help fill any gaps. You have to follow a coronation service for 2 hours. Out of interest, technically, all swan-like from what I could hear, did it all go swimmingly, or was there almost the inevitable, just bear with us?
Yeah, there was a moment like that. We have all of our technical outside broadcast vans are computerized now. So everything is on preset, which is set up during the week. And for some reason, one of our mixing desks in the van that I was in developed a life of its own in a rather terrifying fashion. So I wanted some information kind of late on, once we'd actually got underway. We were in the middle of a hymn or something. And so I said to my producer, have you got this information about what Princess Wales is wearing? And he just put his finger on the button and said, just got a couple of technical problems here. I will get back to you. And I've worked with Ben long enough to know that, you know, there would be no panic in his voice, but the fact that he said that, thought, right, okay, I'm not going to bother him anymore, because there's nothing I can do to help or deal with this situation. All I can do is do my job, which is to be as calm and to carry on as much as possible, unless somebody says, right, you know, you're going to have to move, or you're going to have to put a different headset. So I have 4 different headsets.
I was going to ask you, we have 2 microphones here today. I imagine for a coronation or a Queen's funeral, you have umpteen in front of you in case something goes wrong.
I had one headset, which was the main one. Then I had 2 handheld microphones.
Yes.
So if the microphone had failed. And then there was another headset, which was everything has gone horribly wrong, you're going to have to put this headset on because this is linked to a totally different
At this point, your heart will be racing fast.
And that point, but actually, I think the thing is that actually on the day, because I'd done the Queen's funeral and the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral and various other services, I thought, that's fine, you know, I will just do what I'm required to do. But I mean, that comes with experience, you know, and that comes with having had however many years it is working for the BBC and doing live broadcasting.
We talked about smashing through glass ceilings. How significant do you think it is that a woman was in the position you were in for this key broadcasting moment, whether it was that of the Queen's funeral or whether it was the coronation itself?
I think it's significant in that it wouldn't have happened 10 years ago.
Even 10 years ago?
I think even 10 years ago. Because you think about the leading broadcasters of a generation. And so 10 years ago, it would probably have been a Radio 4 voice, and that would have been a male voice, probably. And somebody who'd had that experience over a number of years. And I don't think it would have been, you know, I think back in 1953, apparently, for the Queen's coronation, there were discussions at the highest levels saying, should we have a female voice involved in this significant moment? But I mean, that would have just been on the ceremonial route.
Yes.
That wouldn't have been in that, you know, idea of being in the Abbey. But I think there was, and probably until quite recently, a sense that women's voices didn't have the gravitas, you know, the weight, the trustworthiness. And when I started out working in sport, you know, which is 30 years ago, we weren't trusted to be commentators. So I was one of the first female voices reporting on football. And in those days, it was a very, very big step forward for the BBC. And some people didn't think it was a step forward. They thought it was a step backwards because they thought, well, how can a woman possibly know enough about such an important topic as football as to be trusted to get it right? And so, you know, and then gradually that has changed over the years, and that we've now got a significant number of female sports broadcasters. But it's the same in news as well. So I think Radio 4, probably until quite recently, you know, they wouldn't have put 2 women. They wouldn't have put 2 women on the Today programme together. It's
5 Live did that first.
5 Live did that first.
Yeah.
But I think it's about becoming established. So I think, you know, the good fortune, I don't want to say it's fortune or luck or anything like that, because actually I deserve to be in that position because I was the most experienced person to do it and had done it before. But if it had happened 10 years ago, it would have been somebody else doing it. And that would have been a man, I think. I'm
getting slightly ahead of myself because I want to chat to you about 5 Live Weekend Breakfast before the end of this conversation. There is now this 50-50 gender split. We've talked about it in previous events where actually there is a real priority given to making sure that there are at least 50% female contributors to programmes now. How significant has that been? You are now, as an interviewer, every Saturday, every Sunday morning, speaking now, I assume, to an awful lot more female voices, female experts.
Yeah, I think when this decision, it's like all of these things, you know, the decision is made and it's the right decision, but it's not always the easiest thing to carry out. So I think producers initially were going, God, we've got to find, you know, we need to find at least 2 female experts or two female voices on this. And actually, in going back to sport as well, because on Weekend Breakfast we do cover a lot of sports. So there are fewer women football journalists out there. There just are. They're in a it's a tiny minority of female voices in football. There are a few in cricket as well. But then when you start doing it, it's not a problem. It's not an issue anymore. But it was. I think it was at the start, and now I think we completely take it for granted that women have as much weight, as much authority, as much expertise, are as good broadcasters. And I don't even know why I'm even saying it or trying to explain it. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it would have been right. Okay, we're making lives very difficult for ourselves. To do the right thing.
I mean, again, this is really interesting information for those of you watching, I hope, in that do offer fantastic female voices in whatever sector, from whatever background, because there is a real appetite, I think, to get people on the air.
Absolutely.
And get the balance where it always should have been, 50-50 in this case.
But it's like all of these things take investment of time or investment of money. And actually, going back to what we were saying at the start about the Women's Ashes, the growth in women's team sports and the coverage that it now gets is completely related to the fact that there is funding. So these players are being paid to play, so they're professionals, and so they are better. They're better, they're fitter, they're stronger. The quality of the game is much better than it would have been 20 years ago.
Our Twitter account @BroadcastRevo is where you can ask some questions. Another one, in part, you've answered this, but do women still face challenges today, in your belief, when it comes to being a respected broadcaster? Are we now there? Yes, we are obviously looking at gender balance and all sorts of things. But is there a challenge still today, 2023? You've talked about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges today is social media, probably still, and I think less for the established broadcasters. So I think people like obviously Claire Balding and me and Gabby Logan and Jackie Oatley and Alison Mitchell, the established broadcasters and journalists don't get it so much. But if you're a young woman starting out, you are still subject to those kind of abusive comments on social media, which I didn't get because there wasn't any social media when I started. So if people wanted to tell me how rubbish I was, they would have to get a piece of paper and a pen,
write you a letter,
and write me a letter, and find the address, and go and find and get a stamp and go to the post box. So it's much easier now, that contact and that ability to be horrible about something, but also just that slight sense that you still have to prove yourself a lot more. I think it's getting better, but I think for most women in pretty much any walk of life, you've still got to prove yourself just that bit more.
Yes. I love the story you've told me before about, alongside David Dimbleby for the Queen's funeral, there's David Dimbleby and yourself chatting away about how it's all going to go. And Dimbleby kind of recounts the tale of where he was sat and where you were sat. And actually, it was rather lovely. You were in the elevated position.
Yes, I had a great position in St George's Chapel, which I've done 3 things in now, which was it was a window, it was an oriel window that was built for Catherine of Aragon by Henry VIII.
Wow. So
that she could watch the Garter ceremonies in St George's Chapel. And it's an amazing, and they put a soundproof box inside that. And it was a similar thing in the Abbey as well. There's a soundproof box, and it's built into this unbelievable position, which is right over the high altar of the altar of St George's Chapel. So particularly for the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, that was absolutely astonishing to be there with just the 30 people who were allowed to be.
COVID restrictions.
Yeah. But for the Queen's funeral, I mean, David he is such a legend. I mean, the Dimblebys, as we know, were the people. I mean, as you say, 10 years ago, it would probably have been a Dimbleby doing what I did. So, but beforehand, on the day of the rehearsal for the Queen's committal service, I was chatting outside St George's Chapel to David and his producer, and he was telling us nice stories about the coronation of 1953. And I said, "Where will you be, David, for the Queen's for the service in a couple of days?" He said, "Well, there was some talk about me being inside the chapel, but I'm going to be sitting in a transit van in a car park at the top of the hill on a wobbly chair, commentating off a monitor." He said, "Where will you be?" I said, Well, I will be in the chapel.
One up.
One up to radio.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're very fortunate. But this is down to a lot of people's hard work and the contacts that you build up, and the fact that it has happened that way for a while. So you have even more of a responsibility to not mess it up.
You were obviously at the rehearsals for both Queen's funeral, the coronation in particular. Was everything going in a swan-like way actually on the ground with the rehearsals? Because I was fascinated to watch the coronation, because it did all seem to go very much to time, rather like clockwork. But I can't imagine, if you're there trying to work out your timings, well, if they're rehearsing, there might be let's do that one again or whatever. Yeah. Any sort of reminiscences from the rehearsals for the coronation?
Well, I mean, the rehearsals were not entirely smooth, I think it'd be fair to say, because there are so many different things happening. It's such a long service. There are so many moving parts. There are so many individual items to be brought in, to be placed in the right place, to be brought out by different people. So all of this cast of hundreds had to know exactly what they were doing. All the musicians, so you had the choir conducted by Andrew Netsing, the director of music at the Abbey, in the choir itself, in the choir stalls, and then on the organ screen, so sort of quite a bit of a distance away, you had an orchestra which was being conducted by a different conductor, so Antonio Papano. So they were having to follow each other's beat using an iPad screen, I think.
Wow.
So Papano was following what Andrew Netsing was doing and having to conduct to his beat. So the whole thing, just the fact that it went so smoothly on the day is a miracle, really, because there were definitely moments in the rehearsal where we thought, right, okay, we've no idea how this is going to work on the day, because it's been chaotic up to this point.
Well, I love the fact that obviously in the rehearsal, the King and Queen now, Charles and Camilla, weren't present, so they had their stand-ins.
That's right, they had stand-ins. Yes, that's right. They had. Well, I think I'm just going to say that the replica crown for
they don't use the real ones for the rehearsals.
They don't use the real ones for the rehearsals. Or I think I don't think they did. I mean, they're very realistic. But the replica crown was somewhat bigger than the head of the stand-in Queen. So the Archbishop did get the giggles slightly, because he lowered the crown onto the Queen's stand-in's head. And it went
So we learned something today. Camilla has a larger head than her stand-in.
Yes.
Okay. There have been happier occasions, less solemn occasions than the funeral and the coronation. The Harry and Meghan wedding, 5 years ago. I'm leading down a road here where actually I'm always interested to hear who was contributing, who you were speaking to, because so many people watching today will want to play a part in large broadcast occasions. But the Harry and Meghan wedding, so much water has gone under the bridge since. But I mean, that joyous occasion, you can probably be slightly freer in the way you're broadcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually that when I did that particular occasion, there was definitely a sense that to have somebody who was younger, I mean, clearly I'm not young in that sense, but was younger than had previous, and obviously more female than previous commentators. I think that was a conscious decision, because it felt like a very different kind of royal wedding, and they were a very different kind of couple. But for getting people on in the build-up, so for the coronation, we had, I was still presenting Weekend Breakfast, not that weekend, but up until the weekend before. So the guests that were invited along, they were, and I think this says something about the royal family as they are now. They were people who represented charities, who represented different organisations. It wasn't the traditional, I think in the 1953 coronation there was an awful lot of ermine and red coronation robes.
Aristocratic contributors.
Very aristocratic. You had the homage of the peers as well in 1953. This did feel like a more, just a more democratic gathering of people. So on the breakfast programme in the weekend before, couple of weekends before, we heard from people who were going to be there. Yeah. And the excitement that they had and the charities that they were representing, it's such a special thing for them. And I think it felt very much the same in the build up to the royal wedding as well, that Harry and Meghan chose different people to invite along who maybe wouldn't have been invited before. And we didn't get to talk to Oprah Winfrey or David Beckham, sadly, on the day. But people who represented organisations that meant something to them.
Yeah, I mean, how much has the rise of the case study, what I would call a real person rather than a talking head from a big organisation, you're trying to weave in real people more and more in broadcast.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I think particularly on Five Live, we would much rather have somebody with a story to tell, a case study, if you like, than a representatives of charities and chief executives of charities are often the best person to give you the context to these things. But
they've often met a royal, for example,
yes,
in the circles they're moving in.
Absolutely. But I think a lot of what we did on Five Live was about, it was kind of the day I met the king.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And it was because we're talking to people who, might have done the same, or you want to be able to tell the stories of real people, particularly on something like Five Live.
I mean, we work with amazing charities, Help for Heroes, Guide Dogs, just to name a couple. And of course, iconic charities like that very often will have had royal interaction. There might be a royal ambassador or president or whatever. And that's a way to kind of latch in even to these major broadcasting occasions where you might actually think, oh, we're not going to get on the air at all. Actually, not necessarily the case.
No, well, because the royal family as a whole are working, all the time with different groups of people in different walks of life, and everybody has a story to tell because it's the one day you're always going to remember.
I mean, I remember covering the Great North Run in 2012, just immediately after the Olympics, immediately after the Jubilee, and you and I were in Newcastle and we were watching, I think, 5 gold medal winners starting the race there in Newcastle that day. Moving on from the grand occasions we've talked about to the grand sporting occasions, one thing that I found working in public relations is former Olympians, former athletes, whether it's football, whether it's athletics, whatever, they often make a great spokesperson because there's a real appetite to hear from them, because very often you want to get their insight into the next Olympics, the next FA Cup final. Are you happy speaking with sports legends who might occasionally have a commercial message too, even on the BBC?
Well, it depends. It depends on how they use that commercial message. And I think obviously, as you say, BBC has got quite strict guidelines as to how much we can plug a product.
Yes.
But it's always good. I mean, there are some people that we have easy access to because they work for us as a pundit. So I will often get an email saying, would you like to interview this Olympian or this cricketer? And I think, well, I'm going to see them next week at Edgbaston, so thank you, but probably we're not the right people to approach about this. So I think it's always been worth being aware of actually who works for other people. But I think when it comes to, I mean, there was a piece I was reading in the Times a couple of days ago with, I think, Ollie Pope, who was representing England cricketer, who was representing a brand, and I can't remember what the brand is, and I should do now. But actually, I thought, well, they've managed to work it in a very subtle way.
Yes.
So if it's a wellness brand, you could probably talk to somebody about their fitness regime and what sort of supplements they might need to take and how they have. So I mean, James Anderson, for example, who is extraordinarily going to be 41 this summer and is still bowling for England in the Ashes. But there is, his longevity and his use of science is part of the story.
Yes.
Of Jimmy. So yes, I mean it's finding that right fit, isn't it?
Less is more is often my advice to anybody. And I mean, more often than not, you're going to be introducing somebody where actually, if it's a brand that they're representing, that brand might actually be in their title when you're introducing them. In which case, you could argue, particularly on the BBC, well, your brand's had a mention. You've mentioned it. Yes. Doesn't need to be mentioned again.
You don't need to.
Less is more.
There. I think so, absolutely. And obviously there are some, so if we were talking on Weekend Breakfast about something to do with wellness, for example, or about the use of vitamins or about veganism, for example. I mean, that's been something that we've talked about a lot, and about whether that's a healthy nutritional. You can have a healthy, balanced diet as a vegan. You might say, right, well, let's talk to a supplements company. Let's talk to brands that have a particular news story a particular way of covering a news story that is relevant and significant.
I mean, I can imagine during these iconic periods of royal funerals, weddings, coronations, it's going to be the constitutional experts, the historians, very often people from a university and academic background, former military, case studies. That's who's on at those points. Let's switch to Five Live Weekend Breakfast for a second. I mean, I used to produce that programme with you presenting. We used to have 9 items an hour. People used to be on, but they used to be off quite quickly. We were piling it in. I sense it's a programme that can breathe a little bit more now.
Yes, I mean, we have a lot of what we do at the weekends is sports orientated, obviously, but we probably have about 6 items an hour.
Right.
So you'd have news, you have 3 items per half hour with news and sports news at the bottom of the hour. So there is you are constrained by time with how much you can, how much you want to try and squeeze in. But then it gives us more time to let an item breathe and to have fun with things.
There are going to be major news events that happen over a weekend. I mean, what are your dream guests in this context? I mean, our own newsroom team here at Broadcast Revolution, we're always trying to identify somebody who can maybe be an expert commentator on a whole sector. It might be, for instance, something financial, mortgages. The cost of living is the number one story at the moment.
Yeah.
Do you have an appetite for that sort of expert? It might be somebody working for one of the big banks or one of the big financial powerhouses, but they can offer you some insight on broader stories. Mortgages, harder to get these days, interest rates rocketing up.
I don't think that there is one. I mean, there are certain guests that you find in certain fields where, for example, Simon Calder from The Independent, who is the definition of, if it's a story about trains or travel or anything, the immediate thought is, right, we need Simon Calder or somebody like Simon Calder.
Yes.
Because he's so across his brief.
Wouldn't it be lovely, though? We're always delighted to offer a female travel expert.
A female travel expert. Absolutely. Well, that would be great. I mean, Lisa Mino, who's the travel editor of The Sun, is somebody that we go to quite often. But actually to have someone else, to have different people, to say, right, just for a change, we're not going to press the Calder button. Yeah. And I've known Simon for many, many years, and I love him to bits, and he always does a fantastic job. But to have somebody who is, just is
keep the fresh voices coming.
The fresh voices, it's exactly what we want.
Let me just turn to a couple of questions reaching us. We've already been chatting for 45 minutes. Charity PR here. Charities love awareness days. There's often pressure internally from non-media colleagues to get Awareness Day media coverage. How important is an Awareness Day, week, month to you, and how newsworthy is it? In the end, what are you wanting here? The feeling is you'll still want a story. You'll still want some good statistics, good case studies, for example.
I think we often do stories around awareness. I mean, Mental Health Awareness Month obviously is something that comes around, and generally speaking gets quite a lot of coverage across the BBC. I think on 5 Live as well, we've done a lot of stories about mental health. I was one of the first to do stuff about mental health in sport 15 or so years ago. So that conversation has undoubtedly improved. So I think it's always good to be reminded of an issue which we can then build programming around. But it's not always the case that I think a week is better than a day.
Yes.
In my view, because otherwise you think, right, well that was yesterday and we've missed it.
Yeah.
And because something else has happened, but I do think it's a useful thing.
Do you think that actually, if a story's good enough, it'll stand up without the need for an awareness day and an awareness week?
Yes, absolutely. And often these things are brought to the fore by another news story that's happened elsewhere. If somebody has, in the most, I'm trying to think. Well, do you remember Jenny Gow, who is a colleague of ours who works in Formula One? So she's just 40, I think. She presents 5 Live Formula One. She had a stroke at the start of this year, and it was utterly shocking because it came completely out of the blue, as stroke often can. But on a couple of days afterwards, when she's posted, posted stories about it. She released a statement. I said we should do something about stroke in the young.
Yes.
Because actually a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, his wife had a stroke in her 30s. And I didn't know at that point that this is something that could affect people so young. So we had a brilliant guest on from the Stroke Association to talk about that on that particular day. So, I mean, you know, I don't want it to sound insensitive.
No.
But it felt like a really good way to focus attention
Yes.
on something that I thought, well, I don't know this. Chances are our audience won't know this either.
And this is a way, I mean, it's so often a story will be there where somebody actually has something to say on an issue already in the news. You're not having to commission research, do something bespoke. Actually, if you've got something to say, and the cost of living gives us a fund of different pressure points. I think
Absolutely.
interest rates and mortgages could be one of the big issues kind of going into the tail end of 2023. That there is always the appetite for more. And even if you're doing 6 items an hour rather than 9 on Weekend Breakfast, that's a lot of material, a lot of voices.
And we do try and, you know, sometimes we'll focus on this, on aspects of the same theme over 3 times in the 3 hours. Sometimes we'll just give it one slot. But yes, I mean, I think yeah, you say cost of living is another big key story for the BBC, and it has been for the last year or two.
Thanks to Tom Marriott, who's tweeted. Hi, Tom. Interesting little marriage here of royal stories, sporting stories, and actually an editorial context here I'm interested in. It's Royal Ascot next week. Will you be looking to speak to bookmakers in particular for the latest betting news? Do bookmakers get on the sports programmes, or is there a feeling now, actually, let's leave the betting to one side?
Hi, Tom. They always have.
Yeah.
They always have traditionally. So I've presented the Derby on a number of occasions, presented from Ascot as well, and from the Grand National. So yes, we have always in the past had bookmakers on, you know, or representatives from a major bookmaker, William Hill or Bet 365, whatever. I haven't seen anything to say this doesn't happen now, because betting is an important part of horse racing.
Yeah. You need to know the odds. I mean, it's a key part of the horse race.
You do. So yes. I mean, I don't think if we are having bookmakers on, then obviously they're not going to say, you know, come down and put your mortgage on this one, because that would probably be a bit.
And again, be careful with what you're branding on. You're on because you're a bookie, not because you're from a certain bookies.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. I mean, you know, so you will always identify which company.
Dare I say, play the game.
From.
You're on, but if you're going to promote it and use it as an advertising thing, that's not going to please the BBC.
Don't say go down to your local William Hills and do this. You know, say these are the odds, but we will always say here's so and so from this company.
Here are you. You've been at so many grand, massive sporting occasions. Back to Royal Ascot with a second question from Tom. What sort of coverage does Royal Ascot get on the BBC, given, he says ITV, I think, have the TV broadcast rights, but of course, the radio broadcast rights, that is where the BBC can still latch in. Yes.
I mean, the BBC Radio still covers the major racing, the race meetings of the year. So the Derby, the Grand National, as I presented Derby Day a number of years in a row. And we will always present and Cheltenham as well. What it doesn't have is quite the profile across 5 Live. You know, we won't give over the whole of the week of Cheltenham week to 5 Live and take the news programmes off air. But we do on Sports Extra, so it is still there, and that hasn't changed since ITV. I mean, ITV have had the rights to racing for quite a long time, I think.
Yeah.
But it's still there on radio.
Another question coming in on our Twitter feed: does a weekend programme on 5 Live have a particularly different focus? You've mentioned there is quite a sporting element.
Yeah. Oh, I think so. I think we feel pretty much as if we kind of kick back a little bit and try and have a bit of a weekend feel about it. So we tend, unless it's a huge political story, we don't.
Plenty of those about at the moment.
Well, there are quite a lot of those about at the moment. But we won't always do a big political story on a. I mean, quite often will on a Sunday, because you've got the other political programmes going on. You've got Laura Kuenssberg's programme and so on. But it's, you know, we like lifestyle-y stories at the weekend, so we try and think what people are going to be doing with their weekend. You know, so they might be, you know, we did a lot about park run, for example, when that, you know, people would be saying, oh, I'm going to do a park run this morning.
Yeah.
So people who are doing active things, people who are doing a bit of gardening or DIY, or they're cooking. So we quite like food items, or I love a food item always. Chris quite likes a gardening. Chris Warburton is my co-presenter. Quite likes a gardening item. He fancies himself as being slightly green-fingered.
So that lifestyle element does actually have a place, often at the weekends.
It definitely does. I mean, there's so for example, the idea of don't cut your grass in May.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of thing that we talked about as well. About is it better to leave your grass to grow a bit longer? Yeah. And so those are the sort of things that we do. People are thinking in a different way at the weekend.
You've done an awful lot of broadcasting from the BBC's Media City in Salford. 2011, we were up there kind of getting underway with the broadcasting from there. How much is there an appetite on the programmes you work on for non-southeast of England voices?
I mean, it's a very interesting question actually, because there was certainly a point when we were all working in London together when you really did focus, a lot of your pundits came from London, and it was the question of people you could get into the studio.
Yes.
What happened in COVID was that we all started broadcasting from completely different parts of the country, and I think that then took away that idea that you had to have people in the studio all the time. And technology has improved from that point of view as well, so that you don't actually have to have somebody go into a studio. You're
happy on 5 Live Weekend Breakfast, Zoom, FaceTime audio.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And particularly if you can get something visualised as well.
In the studio in which you sit, which on occasions now Nikki Campbell's 5 Live phone-in is on the news channel, I'm kind of staggered how televisual radio is more and more.
Yeah.
Are you, if somebody's contributing on the radio, is their webcam on or off for 5 Live Weekend Breakfast? Does it matter?
We will often ask for people to be visualised, and if they don't want to be visualised, then that's fine.
It's okay to say, actually, I'd rather not.
Okay, it's absolutely okay to say, I'd rather not.
Useful to know.
But what it does give you is just that bit more profile on social media.
Yes, you can.
Because if it's a visualised interview, you can then clip it out and post it on social media. I have very mixed feelings about, I kind of joined radio so I didn't have to put my makeup on first thing on this weekend morning, and now there are cameras on us all the time.
Wow, yeah.
But yes, but going back to the original point about having a broader regional spread, I think being in the Northwest has improved that. It's not all about the Southeast. Sometimes it can be a bit all about the Northwest. But actually, I think it is. I think we have a more fully national outlook.
Maybe Southeast and Northwest do get the lion's share, and actually think again. Maybe try and avoid a Southeast and a Northwest. Let's try and celebrate the West Country.
Well, exactly. I will say, can we not get somebody on who is in Taunton or Ipswich or Worcester?
Poor old Northeast. Northwest is now stealing a lot of the thunder for the North.
Yeah,
that's very interesting. Let's try and wrap it up with a couple of quick fire ones, if we may. Again, via our Twitter feed. What's been your career highlight? I mean, wow. I mean, we're talking now. You've now anchored the first coronation in 70 years, so I can imagine that's going to be up there.
I think that's pretty much up there in a sense of having that focus and that attention and the challenge of doing something like that and the relief when it is over as well. And I think the Queen's funeral actually that felt like such a national moment, because I think everyone did. We'd all been waiting for such a long time, and I think the emotion that was tied up in that was very significant, and I felt as nervous doing that as anything I've ever done.
The sporting highlights.
I mean, well, if I go to Paris next year, which I hope I will, it will be my
Olympics
14th
time again. 14 Olympics, wow.
And that includes 4 Winter Olympics. So if you're thinking 14 times 4, she's not that
winter
old.
Every 2.
Winter as well. I think, the Sydney Olympics I absolutely loved. And actually covering anything in Australia is bliss, because I love going to Australia, and the Australians are passionate about sport as we are here. But I loved the London Olympics as well, because we'd built up to, there'd been this scepticism beforehand in the build up to London. People said, oh, the weather's going to be terrible, the transport's not going to work, people aren't going to come out, we're not going to win any gold medals. And I was thinking, you're wrong on all of these. I couldn't guarantee the weather, obviously, but I thought people will love the London Olympics and they'll get completely tied up in it. And I remember coming back on the final day, having covered the modern pentathlon, which is a sport which I love, but it's pretty niche. And I got a taxi back from Greenwich Park with a taxi driver who said, "Oh yeah, I was. What have you been covering then?" And I said, "Well, I was doing modern pentathlon." "Oh yeah, the old modern pentathlon. Yeah, I watched that." He said, "Yeah, that's Sam Murray. She did quite well, didn't she?" So yeah, she didn't have a great time in the fencing, but then had a great swim, didn't she? And then that horse was amazing. So I was thinking, I'm having a conversation about the modern pentathlon with an East London taxi driver at the London Olympics.
Which perhaps shows that actually, if that was an aspirational spokesperson for whatever reason trying to get on the air, there is a fondness, I think, for the 2012 Olympians.
Yeah.
Even those who didn't necessarily have much success, I think there's something burnt in our memory banks about 2012.
But it's why I love sport, because it brings people together. In the same way that we've been talking about big occasions, the big royal occasions, the big sporting occasions, the things that are live and people engage with at that moment. Live. There's nothing like live broadcasting, I don't think, from that point of view.
One more question for you. You've sat in front of a live radio microphone, I think, at one of the most terrifying times, whether it's a significant royal funeral, the coronation. If somebody is watching this and they have to offer advice to a colleague who's about to do a radio interview, or if they're about to do one themselves, in a nutshell, what would you say? Before someone's going on the air, that they're not as practiced as you are, they're terrified, quite understandably.
Yeah.
What should they be thinking?
I think it's a little bit like, I've made this comparison before, like playing in a test match, or playing in a big sporting event. If you can make yourself familiar with the environment that you're in. So before an FA Cup final, the manager will, the players will always go to Wembley the day before, so that some of them might never have played there. So you find out where the dressing rooms are. You find out what it feels like to walk onto the pitch. You look around. You absorb you absorb what the environment is like, so that you're not intimidated by that. So in the same way that I went to Westminster Abbey, sat in the commentary box where I was going to be, had that sense of what it was going to feel like to be there, and I have had the good fortune to have experienced that on a number of occasions now. So I would say, if it's one of those moments when you've got somebody who's not familiar with broadcasting, make sure that they have familiar things around them. They know what chair they're sitting in. They feel comfortable in their chair. They've got water to hand. What they're going to wear, and they're comfortable wearing it. Make sure that if they feel like they need to brush their hair beforehand, they've given themselves time to do that. To have gone to the loo. I went for about 4 panic wheeze before the coronation. I needed to know where the loos were. And there were portaloos in the broadcast compound, so I was all right from that point of view. So it's just making yourself feel as comfortable as you can with the things that will make you feel relaxed. And then remember that the person who is talking to you wants you to sound great as well.
Yes.
We want people...
It's in their interests.
We want people on the radio who are comfortable and relaxed and can engage with us in a natural way. And I mean, hopefully, I think one of the things that I'm proud of as an interviewer is that I can make people feel as comfortable and relaxed as they can in what is a pretty unnatural situation, as we know. But if you can make it feel natural, so actually just kind of pulling the curtain back, the chairs that Mike and I are sitting in are very comfortable for you because you've got long legs. I've got very short legs. So to make myself comfortable, I went and grabbed a cushion from over there.
Yeah.
So I've got a pink cushion behind.
And your posture would be perfect for a Zoom.
I'm now comfortable.
Yeah, yes. I could talk to you for another hour, but we have run out. We have done an hour. So Ellie,
people have lives.
Ellie, thank you so much for your time. And thanks to those of you watching live. I gather a couple of questions should be appearing on your screen now. We would greatly appreciate your input, as it does help shape these events in the future. Our next event, we do aim in late July or thereabouts to be focusing on the now merged BBC News Channel and BBC World. What does that new combined global and domestic news network want from guests and spokespeople who appear on the air? We'll be aiming to find out more about that. But my thanks to Ellie, and until the next time, goodbye.